right. At the end of the last lesson, we talked about parenting with boundaries in mind. And as I said then, yes, if you're parenting children of just about any age, this will probably be helpful. But it also applies to discipling. When someone comes to the Lord, I think they're going to follow some of the same stages that we're going to talk about here in a minute. How impressed would you be if I could boil parenting down to 3 words? 3 words. How impressed would you be if I could make parenting that simple? Now, you got to remember, simple and easy are not the same thing. So I think I can boil it down to 3 words. I mean it now, 3 words. But that doesn't mean it's easy. But I really do think they're the keys to parenting and interacting. I would say they're, to some degree, the key principles in almost any relationship. In fact, I would say they're the key issues even in God's relationship with us as he created us. So let's talk about general, and I'm saying general because I don't want you to feel like they're like solid lines, they stop and start. They kind of blend into one another. But general developmental stages in parenting and, remember, almost any growing relationship. If you remember back in our first or second lesson, I think, we talked about direct, indirect, or no control. And actually, what stage or what word would best, which of those 3 would best capture parenting? Direct control, indirect control, or no control? Now, obviously, in a live teaching, you're going to have people that say no control. You don't have any control over your kids. And hopefully that's not true. But here's the right answer. Direct control, indirect control, or no control over children, your children. The answer is they should go through all 3 stages. They should pass through a stage where, remember, anything over which you have direct control, you're responsible. So they should pass through a stage where basically their entire life, safety, growth, and development is your responsibility. We would call that stage dependence. They are totally dependent upon you for everything they need. And that generally lasts from about 0 to 12. And again, please don't get hung up on the exact year, but it generally lasts from about 0 to 12. And then indirect control, somewhere in the 12, 13-ish range, a child begins to enter into what we call adolescence, and changes start happening in their body and whatever. And the center of their universe begins to shift from parents to peers. Their friendships become much more important to them. Their reference points for right and wrong and all that kind of stuff can begin to shift. And that would definitely be in this area we call indirect control. And again, 13 to 21-ish, 25, I don't care. It's not, the year's not that important. What's important is that you understand that you've got to adjust your parenting. And we would call this stage, I would call this stage, and I'm comfortable calling it, independence. Because ultimately, your goal during adolescence is to gradually give your child more and more responsibility for managing their life. And I'm going to answer the question about how simple it can be in a minute. But that's where they begin to figure out who are they, who do they want to be, and where they're going to take their life. So 0 to 12 was direct control, dependence. 13, 21, indirect control, independence. And then they hit a point where you might call it the launching stage. And this is where it gets a little tricky for parents, because here's where it gets uncomfortable. This is a stage of life where your goal is to have no control. Your goal is to raise a human being who doesn't need you, who doesn't have to return to you for advice and comfort and whatever, particularly if they happen to be married to somebody else, because they need to be learning to go to one another, God, of course, for that. So what would I call this stage? You got direct control, dependence, indirect control, independence. This no control, I would call interdependence. And what I mean by that is, don't force your help on me, but I can ask for it if I want. And again, it has a lot to do with that. The key word with boundaries, and the key word with boundaries is responsibility. Have you ever heard anybody call a certain age the terrible twos? The terrible twos. Fascinating. I do have a little bit of bad news for you, though. If you can't manage a 2-year-old, you better get a counselor for when they hit teen years, because if you can't manage them when they're 2, you're never going to survive teenage years. And whatever, it's not hard to manage a 2-year-old. Let me go ahead and give you my little simple secret. Here's the secret to parenting. Here's the secret to most relationships. 3 words. Remember, I told you 3 words: freedom, choice, consequence. Freedom, choice, consequence. What do you mean? You give age and stage appropriate freedom. Age and stage appropriate freedom. Within that freedom, they make choices, right? Good ones, bad ones. Remember, we talked about that. Then your job is to make sure they experience a consequence that fits their choice. Bad choice, bad consequence. Good choice, good consequence. Well, guess what? Freedom, choice, consequence. Let's say it's a 4-year-old, and remember the pick up your blocks and you can have a snack stuff. Well, let's say there's been some consistency there, and you relax and say, you can have extra privileges if you manage this well for the week or something. What you've done is you've expanded the freedom. That child's going to make choices within that expanded freedom. And growth is the ability to handle that expanded freedom in a way that ends with good consequences. Now, maybe it's because I've taught this so long, but I really don't understand why that's difficult to understand. If a child's behavior is unsatisfactory, bad, they need to experience a consequence that fits that. Why? So that they understand that when I make a choice, I have to face the consequence. The problem comes in when they make a choice that they know is bad, and somehow they're protected from the consequence of it. So again, back to the 3 words: freedom, choice, consequence. Let's shift up into adolescence. How do you apply freedom, choice, and consequence? Let's go to driving. Wow, this is a good one. And by the way, remember direct control, indirect control, no control. And for the third one, no control, you need somebody bigger than yourself you can trust. Here's the thing. When your children are ready to learn to drive, wow, is it a test of your faith. When the first time your child ever gets in that car and drives away. Now, you talk about an insane amount of freedom. Remember, freedom, choice, consequence. So what you want to do is intentionally define the freedom, define choices, good and bad, and then the consequence. So, daughter wants to go to the mall with her friends. The mall's 3 miles away. First time she's ever driven by herself. And you do the whole deal, and you say, okay, here's the deal. You can go for 2 hours, whatever. And you say, I need you back by 5 o'clock. And you stress, this is a big deal for your mom and I. We love you so much. You have no clue how much we love you. This is such a big deal to us, and we need you to handle it well. And if you don't handle it well, there's going to be consequences that you're not going to enjoy. So son or daughter takes off with their friends, and this is in the day of cell phones, so they have cell phones. So they just get caught up, and it's 5:05 and 5:10, and you're at home, the parent, and you've not heard anything. They roll in about 5:30, and they're all excited. They had a blast, and you've got a real important decision to make. Are you going to adhere to the simple formula, freedom, choice, consequence? Now, I don't think the consequences need to be nuclear, but they do need to be adequate to communicate that the freedom you were given is a really big deal, and you're responsibly handling that by making good choices is a really big deal. How you handle that is going to make a big, big impression on that child. And believe it or not, and I know some parents have a hard time with this, and I think it's because maybe we had a hard time with it ourselves, but children want boundaries. They want structure. They want to know that when I'm asked to do something a certain way, things are going to go well if I do, and they're going to go poorly if I don't. And the universe just feels safer if it runs by consistently predictable rules, for lack of a better word. So boundaries in parenting and early in life are a great way to produce security in a child that my parents love me enough to risk me not liking them by applying parenting. I think I read it or said it in one of the previous sessions, but discipline, and this is just kind of one of my favorite definitions, discipline is the art of teaching a child or a person, an adult, self-control by managing their consequences. Working with a new believer, discipling them. I think it's fair to say that at least for some period of time, they're going to be to some degree dependent on the community of faith around them to help them figure out how does this work? How do I move forward in my faith? How do I deepen my faith? How do I grow in my faith? And then eventually they're going to become more independent. And then eventually they're going to become very interdependent and really be a part of what's happening and able to help, for lack of a better word, parent other people that are enjoying their walk of faith. So here's just another way to say some of what I'm saying. There's 3 life skills to be mastered by 3-year-olds. And I say it that way, but what I'm really trying to say, we all ought to be able to do these 3 things. Number 1, able to form emotional attachments to others without losing a sense of ourself and the freedom to be different. Now, at a 3-year-old, kids are playing, and as kids do, they sort of group up and they form these little cliques. A sign of health would be, say there's 5 or 6 of them playing, and 3 or 4 of them say, well, we're going to go over here and play this other game. And maybe your child's here and doesn't really want to go play that other game, but doesn't want to risk not being liked, accepted, and belonging in that group. So what the child does is, in a sense, betrays herself by not owning what she feels and going and being a part of that, just because of a fear of not being accepted and belonging. Obviously, that same thing can happen in adulthood, where we do things we know we shouldn't do, pursue things we know we shouldn't pursue, and just get involved in things because of what we want from other people. The second thing would be a life skill to be mastered by 3-year-olds, and therefore something that all of us ought to be able to do, is the ability to hear no from appropriate others and respond accordingly. Gosh, I hate to have to sound like I'm beating up on people, but I'm not okay with saying that it's okay for a child to throw a tantrum. Well, no, darling, you can't have that. And the next thing you know, the child's on the floor screaming and kicking and whatever. Here's the deal. You're preparing that child to follow God and submit to his lordship. I don't think that's how you want him or her acting toward God when God doesn't give them what they want. Everything you're doing in raising a child, raising a new believer, working with mentoring someone, you're preparing them for what comes next. And there's some things about parenting that if you look at them as preparation for what comes next, they really don't look like they make as much sense as we think they do. And then the third one would be the ability to say no to others without fear of punishment or manipulation. And obviously, a 3-year-old shouldn't be telling, their parents no. But there's times when we want them to be able to express what they want and what they don't want with confidence and without the fear of rejection and judgment. So I really believe you can boil parenting and developing of ourselves and others into 3 simple words: freedom, choice, consequence. And again, I said simple, not easy. That's not an easy thing to do. So we're talking about boundaries. Maybe I'm starting to kind of wake up to my boundaries are kind of a little bit messed up. What am I going to do about that? I want to build and enjoy healthy boundaries and thriving relationships. What do I do about it? Well, that's what we're going to start talking about in our next session. I'm looking forward to it. See you then. Hey, in this lesson, we talked about the different developmental stages. I'm very comfortable saying that anything you're dealing with now probably was rooted or seeded in an earlier developmental stage. And all that means is you got, your, let's just say 0 to 10, 10 to 20. You could break your life up into decades and look at it, because here's an interesting thought. The way you leave determines the way you enter. So the way you leave one stage determines how you enter the next, which determines how you carry yourself through that stage. And a lot of times we're dealing with something in our present life that the real root system is 10, 20, 30 years ago. I've been in counseling situations where people are wrestling with issues that have to do with people that are maybe even gone. So what if you looked at your core relationships, spouse if you have one, children, parents, coworkers, maybe someone you're working with, and think about how you're being intentionally engaged with this concept of developmental stages. How do you bring that into your discussions, your questions, your projections into the future of what you think the best next steps are? But use the developmental stages in working with any relationship you have.